A woman gave 2 decades of her life to becoming a queen, and in the end, she was handed 48 hours to pack a suitcase. King Charles stood inside Clarence's house and watched the woman he had been married to for almost 20 years walk out on a deadline he had set with his own mouth. And the reason behind it is nothing you would land on if you guessed all day. A broken marriage? No. Quiet friction behind closed doors? No. Secret bank accounts sitting in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands that nobody in that family knew about until a routine audit walked straight into them. What I keep circling back to is the speed. 5 days. 5 days from the moment the king was told about those accounts to the moment a woman lost the titles she had spent 20 years earning. I have been living inside this story for weeks, and institutions simply do not move like that. They never move like that. Something forced the pace. Somebody inside that family stood in a room in the middle of November, looked down at a single sheet of paper, and made a call. If that call had gone the other way, and it very nearly did, you would never have heard one syllable of this. I will get to her. She is the reason this story exists at all, and she is the piece almost every version of it quietly left on the floor. If you are new here, tap subscribe before we go any further because this thing is still in motion, and I will be covering whatever comes next. One quick thing before we go deeper. I am Harold. I spend my time digging through everything that circles this family, the filings, the official records, the stories that got shoveled under before anybody finished asking the obvious questions. What follows is me assembling the pieces the way I read them. Stay with me all the way to the end, because the final stretch is where this whole thing comes down to earth and it lands on somebody almost nobody was watching. Begin where the public began. The statement dropped at 6:47 in the morning on the 3rd of December. Hold that time in your head for a moment because palace statements do not arrive at 6:47 in the morning. They arrive at 10 after the communications people have carried the wording twice around the building. Sanded so smooth you have to read it 3 times before you work out what anybody is actually saying. This one hit before most of Britain had filled the kettle, and it said precisely what it meant. Buckingham Palace announced that the king had formally requested parliamentary action concerning the titles and status of Camilla Parker Bowles, her maiden name printed in the statement. That was the first flare in the sky. And anybody who follows this family caught it instantly. Nobody drops a woman's pre-marriage name into an official palace document by accident. Somebody typed those words on purpose. Somebody senior signed off on them. And the message buried underneath was that the institution had already stopped counting her as one of its own. The statement went on. Serious financial irregularities and undisclosed accounts had been uncovered, and continuing the Queen Consort title was no longer appropriate. That is not how a separation gets announced. Couples separate and palaces release 3 warm sentences about mutual respect and privacy. This was an amputation. The institution cutting a person out of itself in public at first light, with not one soft edge anywhere in the text. And the timing tells you they wanted it out before anybody could get in front of them. No friendly news cycle, no quiet Friday evening drop. Get it out before somebody else tells this story first. Which leaves the single question I could not put down, and this entire video is built on top of it. Somebody was racing something. Work out what, and you have the whole story. Before we go on, understand the ground this landed on from the very first minute. Everything that happens to Camilla in public happens on top of a grave. Diana died in 1997, and Britain decided that same day who was to blame. And no quantity of good behavior since has ever fully settled that account. That is the soil this scandal fell into. And it is exactly why 5 days was even thinkable. Come back to those 5 days, because the 5 days are the giveaway. Financial scandals inside enormous institutions take months to surface. That is not cynicism. That is simply the machinery. An irregularity appears. Auditors write it up. Lawyers review the write-up. And somewhere around month 4, a communications team starts building a version the public can be handed without the building going up in flames. By the time it reaches you and me, the thing has been filed down into something survivable. None of that happened here. The king was shown the full picture on the 28th of November. The statement went out on the 3rd of December. 5 days. And inside those 5 days, they convened an emergency session of the Privy Council, drafted legislation overnight, pushed it through Parliament, and had the king sign away his own wife's titles. That is either overwhelming evidence or personal fury trampling every instinct that institution has towards slow, careful management. From everything I have been through, it was both. And there was a third thing shoving from behind, which is the piece I am holding for later. The whole business started with something so dull you would scroll straight past it. In May of 2025, Parliament passed legislation requiring enhanced financial transparency for senior royals receiving public funding. Nobody was targeted. Nothing was aimed at anybody. Nobody in the family objected at the time because on paper it was housekeeping, the sort of modernization push governments enjoy announcing, the kind that appears whenever public appetite for accountability builds up enough that pressure has to be released somewhere. Independent audits, full disclosure of assets, ordinary governance that most public institutions already do, and that the monarchy had been quietly getting along without. The audit firm Reynolds Partners opened their review in September. They worked from the top down, the king first, then the queen consort's office. And honestly, the queen consort's finances were meant to be the easy afternoon of the entire job. An allowance from the Duchy of Lancaster, some personal wealth out of her first marriage settlement, household expenses, filed and boring. Nobody expected to find a thing. Then in October, an auditor named Sarah Mitchell noticed something odd while working through payment authorizations. Monthly payments were going out to what appeared to be a financial management firm in Luxembourg, around £5,000 a month. And if you are sitting there thinking $5,000 a month is hardly the crime of the century, you are right, and that is precisely why it sat there unnoticed for so long. The size was never the problem. The problem was that these payments had never been properly categorized anywhere in the palace accounting system. Mitchell requested documentation explaining them. What came back was vague, something about estate management services, no specifics, no contract, no named estate. And if you have ever worked anywhere near auditing, you already know what a vague answer to a precise question is. It is a flare going up over a field. Auditors are not naturally suspicious people. They are bored people, and nothing wakes a bored auditor faster than somebody being unhelpful about a small number. Mitchell followed protocol and asked to speak directly to the Luxembourg firm. The firm was not managing any estate. It was not managing anything at all. It was a shell company. And if that term is new to you, a shell company is a business that exists only on paper, no staff, no real operations, and its entire purpose is to sit between two other things so nobody can easily trace the line joining them. Money enters one side, money leaves the other, and the paperwork in the middle makes the journey painful to follow. This one existed to receive funds from various sources and push them onward into accounts held in Camilla's name across several countries. And that shell company was itself owned by another corporate entity registered in the British Virgin Islands. That is the moment the floor gave way. One paper company owned by another paper company in a second country does not simply happen to a person. Nobody wakes up accidentally owning a layered offshore structure. Somebody builds it. Somebody pays professionals to build it. And any auditor recognizes it on site as a machine constructed for one purpose, making financial activity difficult to trace. Mitchell escalated to her senior partners. They went to the palace. The palace brought in forensic accountants, and the picture stopped being a small, uncategorized payment. 3 separate accounts at banks in Geneva and Zurich, opened between 2003 and 2005, holding a combined balance of roughly $3.2 million. Look hard at those dates, because the dates in this story carry more weight than the numbers do. Charles and Camilla married in April of 2005 at Windsor Guildhall. That is real. You can look it up. Most of you watching will remember the coverage. Those Swiss accounts were opened in the run-up to that wedding and in the months surrounding it. The transaction history showed regular deposits from a spread of sources. Some British, some routed through places that made tracing genuinely laborious. Withdrawals were almost non-existent. Money went in and stayed in, which tells you these accounts were designed to accumulate, not to spend. Nobody was buying handbags out of Zurich. Something was being stored. Then the Cayman Islands accounts, opened in 2007, holding over $4 million. The money arrived largely from British sources, moving through intermediate accounts that blurred the starting point. And here is the detail that turns this from awkward into fatal. The deposits kept arriving through 2024. Read that again. This was not old money from a previous life that somebody simply forgot to mention. This was not a dusty account from the 90s with a forgotten password. Money was flowing into these accounts throughout her entire run as Duchess of Cornwall, throughout the coronation year, throughout her time as Queen Consort. Camilla was crowned in Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May, 2023, and the deposits continued after that. Ongoing concealment, not an old oversight nobody ever got round to correcting. Luxembourg held the third cluster, roughly 1.3 million, and it seems to have functioned as a collection point, gathering smaller payments before pushing them outward towards Switzerland and the Caymans. Forget the sums for a second and look at the shape. Money arrives at a collection point in one country, moves out to accounts in two others, and two paper companies sit in the middle of the route. Somebody designed that. Somebody sat down with people who do this for a living and worked out how to move money without it being obvious. Nobody does that by accident. Then the investigators started asking the only question that ever truly matters in a case like this. Somebody had put that money there, and the file did not say who. That is where it stopped being a compliance story. Some of it appeared to originate with wealthy individuals connected to Prince Andrew's social circle, including several who had been associated with controversial figures or with businesses that were themselves under investigation for financial irregularities. Other deposits trace back to companies operating in sectors where a royal connection would be worth a great deal to somebody. Nobody has proven a direct arrangement. I want to be careful there, and you should be careful there too. But the timing of certain deposits, landing close to events Camilla hosted, close to causes she publicly championed, produced a pattern the investigators kept returning to. And then there is Andrew, which is where this turns properly ugly. Money landed in Camilla's accounts during the exact stretches when Andrew was known to be scrambling for funds to cover legal costs and settlement money. No direct transfer between the two of them could be traced. Nobody found a single payment carrying both names. But the timing lines up again and again across years, and at some point, a run of coincidences stops resembling coincidence and starts resembling a method. You already know Andrew's history here. The BBC broadcast that Newsnight interview in November of 2019, and within days he had stepped back from public duties, and the family has been managing the wreckage ever since. That part is real, and it is on the record. What the investigators were now staring at was the possibility that while the institution was publicly holding Andrew at arm's length, money connected to his world had been running quietly through the accounts of the woman standing beside the king. Nobody has confirmed what anybody intended here, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But watch what the family does next, because their actions say considerably more than any statement anybody released. Palace officials brought Princess Anne into it in the middle of November, and they did it for one reason. The scope had outgrown undisclosed assets and crossed into territory that looked criminal. Once a thing crosses that line inside that family, somebody has to be told who will not flinch. Anne is the one they call. She always has been. No drama, no briefing of favored journalists, no interest whatsoever in how any of it plays. She turns up, reads the file, and says out loud the thing nobody else in the room wants to say. According to those briefed on the investigation, Anne's reaction was horror. And what she said once she had worked through the documents is the sentence the entire case would eventually rest upon. She said this was not merely hidden money. She said this was a structure built to conceal ongoing financial activity from the family, from palace officials, and from the authorities. That level of planning, she said, points to somebody who knew they were doing wrong, not to somebody who overlooked a bit of paperwork. Sit with that because it is a far heavier statement than it first sounds. The auditors had found balances, money parked in banks, undeclared, badly categorized, serious, embarrassing, survivable. Had that been the whole of it, this story ends with a quiet settlement, a revised disclosure, and a paragraph in an appendix nobody outside the building ever reads. Anne looked at the identical documents and named the one thing auditors are not paid to name. She named intent. Undeclared accounts do not cost anybody their titles. Deliberate concealment does. Everything across the following 2 weeks traces back to that single reframing in that one room in the middle of November. And here is the part I have been holding since the opening line. And I am going to hold it a little longer, because if I hand it over now, it is just a woman reading a folder, and you will not understand why it detonated everything. Anne walked into that room ready to bury this. By every account I have seen, she was inclined to handle it quietly, keep it inside the family, protect the institution the way she has protected it her entire adult life. She changed her mind. Something inside that room turned her from the person arguing for discretion into the person demanding transparency, even though transparency meant dismantling her brother's marriage and ending Camilla's position completely. Something specific happened. We will get there. First, understand what was at stake for Camilla, because a flat villain is no use to anybody, and this woman had a staggering amount to lose. Camilla spent 30 years as the most disliked woman in Britain, not disliked in the ordinary way, disliked in a way that got her booed in supermarket car parks, disliked in a way that meant the palace could not put her name on an official document for years without triggering a wave of hate mail, and every ounce of it traced back to one person. Diana died in 1997, the country decided who was responsible, and that verdict walked into every room Camilla entered for the next 2 decades. She climbed out of it, and people forget that. Hundreds of engagements a year, no complaints, no interviews, no attempt to argue her side in public. Standing in the rain in provincial towns for 20 years until the country simply grew tired of hating her. Westminster Abbey, the 6th of May, 2023. A crown on her head while the world watched. She earned that inch by inch. Now picture being that woman in the autumn of 2025, watching an auditor begin asking questions about Luxembourg. You are not thinking about the money. You are thinking about the 30 years. You are thinking that every single thing you built can be lifted off you inside a week if the wrong pages reach the wrong person. And you are thinking about it at 3 in the morning entirely alone. Because the one person you would normally tell is the one person who can never know. That is the fear that explains what comes next. That is why somebody in that position does something reckless. William was briefed on the 25th of November, 3 days before his father learned the truth. Palace legal counsel walked him through the account structures, the timeline, the sources of funding, and what all of it meant if it reached the public in the wrong sequence. William's first question was not about Camilla. He asked whether his father might be tangled up in it, whether Charles could have known and failed to declare. The investigation had found nothing indicating Charles knew, but William understood immediately that the question would be asked publicly regardless of what the investigation said, and that managing that suspicion would be nearly as difficult as managing the scandal sitting underneath it. You want to understand why William reacts to this kind of thing the way he does? Look at where he learned it. He was 15 years old on the 6th of September, 1997, walking behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London while the world stood and watched him do it. Everything private about Diana became public property inside a week. William has spent almost 30 years watching what happens to this family when a private matter escapes in a shape nobody controls, and his instinct never changes. Get in front of it, or it gets in front of you. Charles was told on the 28th of November, and the people who were in that room describe it as the worst briefing of his reign. His advisors laid it out in front of him. The accounts, the amounts, the opening date on every single one, the sources of the money as far as anybody could trace them. Charles refused to accept it. That is the detail that stays with me. He kept reaching for explanations, administrative errors, some innocent reading nobody in the room could locate. He went back through the papers hunting for the version in which his wife had not lied to him, and the papers would not give him one. She had been hiding millions from him for the entire length of their marriage. While he defended her in public, while he pushed for her acceptance, while he asked a hostile country to trust her, all of it while she concealed wealth he did not know existed. He said one thing to his advisors, and everybody who heard it repeated it afterwards. He said she had been hiding millions from him for their entire marriage. He said that while he had been defending her publicly, supporting her rehabilitation, trusting her completely, she had been concealing wealth he never knew was there. His voice, according to one person present, had gone hollow. Understand what that costs a man like Charles. He has done this before. In the 1990s, he stood between two women while the country watched him choose, and that ended in a funeral in September of 1997 and 30 years of repair work. Everything he has done since, every careful step of Camilla's rehabilitation, was him trying to prove the choice had been worth making. On the 28th of November, somebody set a folder in front of him showing that the woman he spent his life defending had been running something behind his back the whole time. He was not only losing a wife that afternoon, he was losing the argument he had spent 3 decades making about his own life. The confrontation came that same evening at Clarence House. Charles cleared the room. Private secretary out, senior aides out, everybody out. 2 protection officers remained within calling distance, because standard security cannot simply be waved away. And those 2 officers are the reason we know anything at all about what the next 3 hours sounded like from the corridor. Camilla came into the study at 7:15. She knew something was wrong. She did not know the scale of it. The first thing she saw told her most of it. Charles was seated behind his desk, not in the informal chairs by the window where the 2 of them always talked. Behind the desk, with a piece of furniture standing between them. After 20 years of marriage, a woman reads that in a heartbeat. He had laid the documentation out across the desk in front of him: bank statements, account opening records, transaction histories, the corporate structures printed and arranged in date order. He said nothing. He gestured at the paper and let her look. He told William afterwards that the silence had not been a tactic. He said he stayed quiet because right up until that moment he still wanted to believe there was an explanation, and he had not been able to think of a single innocent reason for decades of hidden accounts, and he was hoping she would hand him one. She did not. Camilla's first response was denial, and not denial of the accounts. She never tried to claim the accounts were not hers. She denied that anything about them was wrong. Old accounts predating the marriage, family money kept separate, nothing that ever needed declaring. Charles pushed. He pointed at the transaction dates, the ones running through the marriage and straight on through her time as queen consort. The denials thinned and the defensiveness got louder, which is exactly what always happens when somebody is arguing a position they already know will not hold. Then he turned the pages to Andrew. He put the connections in front of her, the people in Andrew's orbit, the deposits arriving during Andrew's worst financial stretches, the timing that aligned too many times to mean nothing. And he asked her directly what she had been involved in, because none of it looked like savings to him. It looked like money laundering, or payments for access, or something equally corrosive to everything he had spent his life protecting. That is when she broke. She said she had been protecting the family. Andrew had come to her years earlier, desperate, drowning, and she had tried to help without pulling Charles into a situation that would force him to choose between his brother and doing the right thing. The accounts, she said, had been Andrew's idea, a way to hold funds with no direct line back to him, parked in her name until the money could move on and cover his debts. Think about what that answer does to her. Either way, it is fatal. If she was telling the truth, she had made herself part of an arrangement built to help Andrew dodge accountability, and that is participation, not family kindness. If she was lying, she had just tried to hang the entire thing on the one member of that family nobody would step forward to defend. Either way, it confirmed the very thing Charles had walked into, that room praying, was untrue. His wife had been involved in financial arrangements she deliberately hid from him, and they were tied to the family member whose scandals had done more damage to the monarchy than anything else in 20 years. Then he asked the question that mattered to him more than any of the rest. He asked whether she had married him with those accounts already open, whether she had stood in front of him at Windsor while hiding this on the same day. Her answer came out hedged, and what it amounted to was yes. Some had existed before the wedding. She had opened others afterwards. And she had never told him because she knew he would demand that every single one be declared or closed. That justification is what finished it, not the money, the justification. Charles told her she had made him part of her deception. Every time he defended her in public, every time he stood before a skeptical country and asked it to trust his wife, he had been vouching for somebody who was lying to him about the basic facts of her own life. He asked whether she understood what she had done to his credibility and to the institution he had waited 70 years to lead. She tried to argue the scale. The amounts were not enormous by royal standards. No public money was involved. She had never used her position to enrich herself, only to help family. Charles cut through all three in one answer that the people briefed afterwards described as devastating. The amount does not matter, he told her. Whether it was public money does not matter. What matters is that you concealed millions, that you may have taken money from sources nobody can account for, and that you lied to me about it for years. That is not a family matter. That is institutional liability. After that, it stopped being a conversation. The two protection officers in the corridor could hear raised voices for a long stretch without ever making out words. Camilla came out 3 hours later, and this is the image I cannot shake. Palace staff watched her cross the landing alone, mascara running down her face, moving unsteadily, one hand braced on the wall. 78 years old, Queen of the United Kingdom that same morning, walking past her own staff at 10 at night with her face wrecked, and not one person stepping forward to help her because nobody in that building yet knew whether they were still allowed to. She went straight to her private apartments. She spoke to nobody. Charles called for his private secretary and his legal counsel that same night, and his instructions were not open to discussion. He wanted a full legal analysis of what removing her titles would require. He wanted her out of Clarence House within 48 hours, and he wanted a statement drafted explaining why. His advisors pushed back carefully, the way advisors do. They suggested this was too fast. They suggested investigating further before doing something irreversible. Charles would not move. She has admitted concealing accounts tied to Andrew's problems. He told them, "That is enough. I will not have the crown implicated in whatever this was." William was summoned to Clarence House at midnight and found his father wrecked but immovable. Charles told him this was not an emotional reaction, whatever it might look like from outside. She had created institutional liability through deception, and as king, he could not look past that, no matter what he felt about her. William agreed something had to happen. He argued for more time, proper process, the normal machinery. Charles refused him too. "Every day she remains queen consort while we know about this," he said, "is another day the institution is lying. It ends now. And now I owe you the thing I have been holding since the beginning, because none of what you have just heard would have happened without it." Go back to the middle of November, to Anne and the folder. Anne was not reading the accounts. Everybody else in that investigation was reading the accounts, because the accounts were the thrilling part, the millions, the islands, the shell companies. Anne read the calendar. Sarah Mitchell sent her first written query about the Luxembourg payments in October. Sitting in the file beneath the banking material, Anne found a set of instructions issued from Camilla's side 11 days after that query landed. Instructions to wind up the Luxembourg entity, instructions to close the Geneva and Zurich accounts and move the balances, and a request that the associated records be cleared out as routine housekeeping. 11 days after an auditor asked her a question. Nobody else had set those two dates beside each other. The forensic people were still mapping where the money had come from. The lawyers were still arguing about disclosure obligations. The whole room was staring at the structure instead of at the clock. Anne looked at the clock, and inside about a minute, she understood exactly what she was holding. Camilla was shutting it down, not tidying up, not coming clean, shutting it down while the audit was still running, and moving to have the paperwork destroyed while a firm hired by Parliament was mid-review. Now work out what that means if it had been allowed to finish. The Luxembourg entity dissolves. The Swiss balances move somewhere with no reporting agreement. The records vanish. Reynolds Partners are left holding a £5,000 monthly payment to a company that no longer exists. And Sarah Mitchell writes an inconclusive note in an appendix about an arrangement that could not be verified. Camilla makes a modest disclosure, apologizes for poor record keeping, and remains queen consort for the rest of her life. You would never have heard about any of it. Not this year. Not ever. Anne stopped it. She made one call that afternoon and had the dissolution and the account closures flagged and frozen before they completed. And she did it before telling Charles anything, before the lawyers had finished their advice, before anybody had decided what the family's position was going to be. She acted first and explained afterwards, which is the single most extraordinary thing in this entire story. That is what turned her. She had walked into that room prepared to bury the whole business, and she found evidence that the woman at the center of it was already burying it herself. Anne is constitutionally incapable of covering for somebody who is actively covering for themselves. The instant she saw those 11 days, discretion stopped being available, because discretion would have made her an accessory to the cleanup. Anne did not expose the accounts. The auditors found the accounts. Anne exposed the attempt to make them disappear. That is a completely different thing, and it is the one that took the titles off Camilla's head. Look at what the concealment attempt did legally. Undeclared accounts are an argument. Somebody can stand up and say the disclosure rules were unclear, the money was premarital, the categorization was sloppy, and a reasonable person could half believe it. Moving to destroy the records 11 days after an auditor asks about them is not an argument. It clears every innocent explanation off the table in one motion. It is the one piece of paper in that entire file proving somebody knew. That is why the Privy Council did not hesitate. That is why Parliament moved in 2 days. That is why 5 days was possible at all. The legal side turned out to be harder than Charles's temper wanted it to be. Ordinary people who want out of a marriage get divorced, and that is the end of the paperwork. Removing royal titles is a different machine entirely. It requires parliamentary action. It requires the Privy Council, and it requires somebody hunting for precedent where almost none exists. The palace legal team worked through the night searching for a comparison. The closest thing they found was the stripping of titles from the family's German relatives during the First World War. And those were foreign royals, not a queen consort sitting inside the household. The abdication crisis of 1936 collapsed just as quickly because Edward walked away voluntarily and nobody removed anything from him. Charles wanted titles taken off a sitting queen consort over financial misconduct, and no precedent for that exists anywhere in modern royal history. Their advice came back in stages. Charles would have to make a formal request to Parliament through the Home Secretary. The Privy Council, the body of senior ministers and judges that formally counsels the Crown, would have to advise on whether any of it was constitutionally proper. Then Parliament would need to pass legislation removing the titles granted by letters patent when Charles and Camilla married. Letters patent, and this is the second and final thing I am going to explain in this video, is the legal instrument a monarch uses to grant a title. It is a document. Somebody wrote it, somebody sealed it. And a title that arrived on a piece of paper can be taken away by another piece of paper. That is the mechanism that made all of this possible, and it is the reason a woman can be a queen on Tuesday and a private citizen by Thursday. Normally, that process takes weeks, months, if anybody wants to be careful about it. Charles instructed his legal team to use emergency procedures, to make it plain to Parliament that time mattered, and to pull every available lever to accelerate it. His position never shifted. Leaving her in the title while investigations continued would make the Crown complicit in whatever those accounts had been built for. The emergency Privy Council session convened on the 30th of November at Buckingham Palace. Senior ministers, judges, and royal advisors in a room on 2 days' notice, over a matter no modern government has ever had to consider. Palace Council presented the evidence, the amounts, the sources nobody could explain, Camilla's own admission of deliberate concealment, and the 11 days. The argument was simple. Keeping the title created liability and destroyed public trust in the monarchy's financial propriety. Taking it away was proportionate to the breach. They deliberated for hours. Several members raised the precedent and the optics of a king divorcing his wife through the machinery of state rather than through a solicitor. Fair objections, and honestly, they never got answered. The constitutional weight of the king's position carried it, and the Privy Council advised that parliamentary action would be proper. The government had been briefed in parallel. The Prime Minister consulted senior ministers and the opposition leader and agreed to introduce emergency legislation. And the speed of that tells you two things. The evidence frightened people, and nobody wanted to be seen dragging their feet while the monarchy burned. The legislation went into Parliament on the 1st of December, drafted overnight, short and specific. It authorized removal of the titles of Queen Consort, Duchess of Cornwall, and everything else granted to Camilla Parker Bowles on her marriage, on the grounds that serious financial irregularities made keeping them inappropriate and damaging to the Crown. The debate was brief because the legislation was an emergency, and the chamber split hard. Some members called it straightforward accountability for somebody holding public position while hiding substantial wealth. Others called it wildly disproportionate. And a few raised the thing that should trouble anybody who thinks about it for 5 minutes: a crown using Parliament to punish what began as a personal betrayal. The vote passed late on the 2nd of December. Strong majority, not overwhelming. Royal assent came immediately. And this is the moment the entire story had been building toward. Charles signed away his own wife's titles. Palace observers described it afterwards as the most painful constitutional duty he has ever performed, and I believe them, because there is no version of that signature that is not a man ending his own life's argument with his own hand. His personal statement went out alongside it, and it was short. He said it was with profound sadness that he had requested parliamentary action regarding the titles held by Camilla Parker Bowles. He said the discovery of serious financial irregularities and substantial undisclosed accounts had made continuing the Queen Consort title untenable. He said the action protected the integrity of the Crown and was not personal vindictiveness. He asked for privacy. Camilla answered through lawyers rather than in her own voice, disputing that the accounts amounted to misconduct and reserving every legal right to contest the removal. Legally, it was already finished. Parliament had acted, the king had signed, and Camilla Parker Bowles was no longer queen consort, no longer a duchess, no longer anything but a private citizen, married to a king in name and nothing else. Then Britain got hold of it, and the country split in a way that revealed more about Britain than about the family. Older viewers, the people who lived through the Diana years and then watched Camilla spend 20 years crawling back, went complicated, sympathetic even. Plenty of them thought Charles had gone well past what the offense deserved, that financial irregularities did not justify demolishing somebody who had finally been accepted. Comment sections filled with people calling her a scapegoat. Younger viewers went the other way, hard. Hidden millions offshore while the country was struggling, while the monarchy was taking public funding and promising transparency. That reading leaves very little room for sympathy about anybody's personal tragedy. And the investigation did not stop once the titles came off. It got worse. Several British businessmen came forward after the story broke, admitting payments to entities connected to Camilla's accounts. They described them as charitable contributions or consultancy fees. Investigators looked at what those payments sat beside in the calendar and formed a rather different view. The worst of it was, again, the timing. Significant sums arrived within weeks of Camilla hosting events attended by wealthy guests, or shortly after she championed a cause that happened to benefit a particular industry. Nobody proved a direct exchange, and nobody needs to prove one for that pattern to do damage. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, her children from her first marriage, came out swinging in a joint statement. She had been trying to help Prince Andrew through an impossible situation. The concealment had been about protecting Charles from having to know. She had never enriched herself. I believe they meant every word, and I do not think it survives contact with the file. If you are helping a family member out of a hole, you do not need a shell company in Luxembourg owned by a second company in the British Virgin Islands feeding accounts in Geneva, Zurich, and the Cayman Islands. That is not a favor. That is architecture. For Charles, the aftermath was worse than the scandal. He spent almost 50 years loving that woman and absorbed an enormous amount of public hostility to be with her. Discovering she had been running concealed arrangements tied to Andrew for the whole marriage was not a financial betrayal to him. It was a question about whether he had ever known her at all. People close to him say he aged visibly within a fortnight, moving through his engagements with the mechanics intact and nothing behind them. He moved out of Clarence House himself, unable to remain in rooms full of her, into Buckingham Palace apartments he had always avoided because he found them cold. William backed his father publicly and worried privately about the precedent. If a king can strip titles from a queen consort, then no position inside that family is permanent, and every royal marriage now rests on different ground than it did in November. Catherine moved up into the senior female role years ahead of schedule, taking on patronages and supporting the king, and by every account handling it better than anybody had a right to ask. The constitutional questions never got answered. Parliament removed a woman's titles at the request of her own husband, and scholars are still arguing about whether that was legitimate cooperation or a precedent somebody less scrupulous will exploit in 40 years' time. And one question keeps circling that nobody at the palace enjoys. Charles knew nothing, allegedly, until the 28th of November. Investigators found no evidence he knew before November. Plenty of commentators find it hard to believe a woman ran concealment on that scale for 2 decades without a single visible signal. And the suggestion that Charles may have chosen not to look has not gone away, and probably never will. Look at where all of this leaves everybody, because this is the part that matters. Charles made a choice that will define his reign whether he wanted it to or not. He picked the institution over the woman, the crown over 50 years of his own life. History will call that strength or cruelty, depending entirely on who is holding the pen, and he will not be around to argue either way. Anne made a choice too. In a room in the middle of November, folder open in front of her, nobody watching, she could have closed it. She wanted to close it. She has spent her whole life protecting that institution quietly, and the quiet option was sitting right there. She picked up the phone instead, and every single thing that followed came out of that one call. And Camilla, 30 years of work, hundreds of engagements a year, decades of keeping her mouth shut while the country said whatever it liked about her, all of it aimed at one morning in Westminster Abbey in May of 2023, gone in 72 hours. 28 years spent climbing out from underneath Diana's shadow, and she has ended up back beneath it by her own hand, which is the one outcome nobody in that family believed was still on the table. I want to be precise about what actually took it, because the story people are telling is slightly wrong. The hidden accounts did not destroy Camilla. She might have survived the hidden accounts. Britain is remarkably forgiving about money when somebody puts their hands up early and looks properly embarrassed about it. 11 days destroyed her. 11 days between an auditor sending a polite written question and a set of instructions going out to dissolve a company and clear the records. She had one chance in October, the same chance anybody gets, to walk into that study and tell her husband what he was about to hear from somebody else. She spent it trying to make the evidence disappear instead, and she lost everything she had spent 30 years building. Not because she had secrets, but because when the light finally came on, her first instinct was to reach for the switch. Thanks for watching. Hit like and subscribe because this investigation is still running, and I will be back the moment the next piece drops.